job, Victor.
What is up, guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another episode of WizKidsForever, episode 3. This is our Karan Butler episode, or our Bradley Beal episode. So you see, I had to bring out the number 3. This is the only time that you'll ever see me wearing any Bradley Beal merch anymore. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into this episode. If you're checking this out on YouTube, be sure to like, be sure to comment, be sure to subscribe. With the draft coming up, I'm going to be sure to push out a lot more draft relevant coverage as we work closer to the NBA draft, with it being a little over 2 weeks away. So you don't want to miss it. So as I mentioned before, be sure to comment, be sure to like, and be sure to hit that subscribe button, because I love when I interact with you guys, chopping it up with you guys in the comment section, and I would love to do more of it. So I can't do it without you guys. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into this episode. To give you a timestamp, as I do for all of my episodes, today is Tuesday, June 4th, 2024, and the Washington Wizards formally introduced Brian Keefe as their 26th head coach in Washington Wizards franchise history earlier today in a press conference, with the announcement coming last week. But the move was made official today with a press conference in a more formal setting, where he was alongside Will Dawkins, and he talked about how his work has got him there, his 19 years in the NBA. And Will talked about, some of the things that led them to, removing the interim tag off of Brian Keefe's name and giving him the keys to the franchise for the near future. To give you my thoughts on the hire, rather meh on the hire. And that was the word that I was stuck on for the last couple of days when the hire was initially announced. But to be more professional on our YouTube channel or for the podcast, the word that I'm going to give you guys on my thoughts for the hire, if I could sum it up in one word, is anticlimactic. And the reason that I say that is because while I don't hate the move by any means necessary, I do think that, Brian Keefe is a guy that he's the guy that is going to lead you through the tank and not necessarily lead you to contention. And let me tell you what I mean by that. We've seen a lot of people since he was named the interim coach, but in late January, I believe, we've seen a lot of people cite interviews from Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook and other guys like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander that talked about how beneficial Brian Keefe was as a player development coach in their careers. Even KD was quoted as saying he was one of the more integral coaches to, his success in the NBA, being a player developer, being a guy that necessarily told you the things that you didn't necessarily want to hear, but told you the things that you necessarily needed to hear. And we saw some of that in his time in the last couple of months of this season when he was the interim coach. We saw some improvements on the defensive end. We saw some improvements on the team as a whole. And we saw guys like Denny Avdia and Jordan Poole take leaps in their play. With Denny, he made career breakouts, and we saw Jordan Poole pick up from the funk that he had started off the season with under, the helm of Brian Keefe. And if we can actually remember, Brian Keefe was the guy that actually put Jordan Poole on the bench because he was actually a starter throughout Wes Unseld Jr.'s entire tenure. But if you look at Jordan Poole's comments later throughout the season, after he had voiced his displeasure after being initially placed on the bench, and if you looked at his social media posts and things of that nature since Brian Keefe has been hired, he seems to be a super advocate of the move. And I understand why, because once he was moved to that second unit, once he was moved to that 6-man role, Brian Keefe Jr. put Jordan Poole he put Jordan Poole in a position to succeed. He put him in a position where he was going to be on ball and not necessarily playing like he was goddamn prime JJ Redick running off ball screens like he was doing with Wes Unseld Jr. So I do love that aspect of Brian Keefe, and we'll be remiss if we didn't acknowledge, the improvement that the team made once he overtook the, head honcho role of head coach. But some of the reasons that I'm kind of mad on the hire and not necessarily jumping for joy is because I kind of question some of the in-game adjustments that I saw from Brian Keefe Jr. I keep saying Brian Keefe Jr. Brian Keefe, excuse me, from Brian Keefe throughout the season. Now, we were coming from Wes Unseld Jr., so he made Brian Keefe look like prime Eric Spoelstra, prime Greg Popovich as far as in-game adjustments and things of that nature, because Wes didn't simply do any of it. He was one of the worst in-game, game-by-game coaches I've ever seen in my life as far as making adjustments. He was a guy that was stuck to his scheme, no versatility, no diversity in his scheme. And while we did see more versatility and more diversity with Brian Keefe Jr., and I know this roster was ass. Trust me, I know this roster was ass. And you couldn't necessarily do much with the roster, especially when we got to the end of the roster and we were playing two-way guys and guys that we picked up off of the subway at LaFont Plaza, for crying out loud. I get that. I would have loved to seen some different in-game adjustments and things of that nature. Some in-game adjustments where, you know, like I said, I'm not necessarily saying that I didn't see any of it. I would just want to see more innovation in it when we're talking about Brian Keefe. But I'm not necessarily disappointed in the hire by any means. I didn't make the Arthur fist and ball up my fist when I saw the hire. It was just rather anticlimactic because I think that this is a move that you could have made a couple of months ago. I know in the press conference today, Will Dawkins had mentioned how they did go through the due process, how they did interview other candidates, but the process led them back in-house and hiring a guy like Brian Keefe. But yeah, as I mentioned before, I'm not necessarily mad at the move because I know that this isn't the most appealing job with a roster or with an organization that you know is going through a rebuild, that you know is going through a couple of tanks, because I really don't think that we want to give the New York Knicks any inkling of a first-round pick that we owe them for, I think, the next 2 years if we finish outside of the lottery. So I think that we will be taking for the next 2 years at least, just to, save face from Tommy Shepard's fucking blasphemy of a tenure or disaster of a tenure as GM of the Washington franchise. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the move. But now time to get to what I really want to talk about. And that's who the Washington Wizards are likely to take at number 26. So if you checked out my last episode, I gave you my 5 favorite prospects. It was right after the NBA draft lottery, and I gave you my 5 favorite prospects for the Washington Wizards at the number 2 pick. But the Washington Wizards also have another pick later in the first round with that 26th pick. And I'm going to break this down into 2 scenarios. Because if you haven't watched my video or since my video, my last video where I mentioned the 5 prospects that I wanted Washington to be looking at with the number 2 pick, I think that there has been a couple of prospects that have risen to the top and have become the cream of the crop throughout the mocks, throughout the workouts and things of that nature, and throughout the days since my last episode. And we know that Alexander Sarr is the presumed number 1 pick. Not necessarily unanimous, not necessarily consensus, but most mocks at the time of my last episode, at the time of the NBA draft lottery, they had him as the number 1 projected pick. I think Jonathan Givony had Zachary Researcher as the number 1. But if you have paid attention, if you've paid attention to rumors, if you've paid attention to the odds makers, there's been a shift. There's been quite the shift where I don't think that Alexander Sarr has necessarily as tight of a stranglehold on the lock of the number 1 pick as he had 2 weeks ago when I made my last episode. And if you haven't checked that episode out, please be sure to check it out. I'll be sure to pin it in the comments because I had some good insight on some of the prospects that I would like for the number 2 pick. But if you paid attention to the odds makers where his odds have actually dropped, and Zachary Reese's odds have actually risen as well to as the likelihood of being the number 1 pick in the 2024 draft over the last couple of weeks. But if you paid attention to as well, there have been a plethora of Kyle Kuzma rumors that have circulated NBA Twitter, NBA circles over the last couple of weeks. We've heard him linked to many different names, whether that be the Sacramento Kings, whether that be the Oklahoma City Thunder, and a lot of teams looking to contend specifically in the Western Conference. And I've seen that the Washington Wizards have put him back on the trade block like they did close to the trade deadline when he ultimately told us that he wanted to stay. I've seen that he's been put back on the trade auction, back on the trade block as we get closer to the draft. I think that we're looking for another first-round pick, potentially in the lottery. I don't know if Kyle Kuzma is the type of player that is going to fetch you a top 10 pick, even in a weak draft. But I think that if we could get somewhere in that late lottery to late teens pick, giving us 3 first-round picks, I think that we're going to go ahead and do that. It depends on the compensation or what other teams are willing to give for Kyle Kuzma. But with that being said, I do think that the likelihood of us selecting Zachary Rissecher has risen since my last episode. He was like number 4 or number 5 on my prospect ranking in my last video. But I think with us looking to shop Kuzma, there's going to be a clear gap and a clear hole for a big jumbo-sized wing like Kyle Kuzma is. And while I'm not necessarily the highest on Zachary Rissecher, he does fit that bill as a 6'9", 6'10", small forward, power forward type wing that gives you some outside shooting ability. And yeah, I think that him and Alexander Sarr have actually risen to the top, and I think that those are the two. Well, everybody knows. We all know, not necessarily, I'm not breaking any news here. We all know that these are the two guys, but there have been reports like Rissecher isn't going to fall past 2, and Alex Sarr damn well better not fall past 2 if he falls past 1. If he falls past 1, you better run to that motherfucking podium to get your guy Alexander Sarr, because you guys know how I feel about him if you checked out our last episode. But to get into the rest of this episode, I wanted to give you 6 prospects broken down into 2 different scenarios. One, if we select Alexander Sarr with the 2nd pick, and another scenario if we select Zachary Rissecher with the 2nd pick. I wanted to give you 3 prospects for each scenario that I wouldn't mind watching and taking a look at with the 26th pick as we move later in the draft. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into this list. So here's our scenario if Alex Sarr or if the Atlanta Hawks were to be goddamn dumbasses and select Zachary Rissecher, whose play has risen since our last couple of weeks, and it has made sense why he has risen on a couple of people's boards, and some people that didn't necessarily think that he was number 1 a couple of weeks ago are starting to think that he is now, because he's balled out in the French League playoffs and things of that nature. But going back to the scenario where the Washington Wizards select Alexander Sarr with the number 2 pick, here are the 3 prospects that I wouldn't mind us looking at with the 26th pick. Because I don't necessarily want us to select another big at that point. I do think that it would be redundant once you get Alexander Sarr, not only mentioning him, but also mentioning my guy Tristan Vucevic, who showed a lot of promise at the end of last season as well. So you don't necessarily want to overcompensate, especially with us. I think that we're playing a lot of 4 out, 1 in, and a lot of 5 out. So you don't necessarily want to have too many bigs taking up space on your roster. So here are the 3 prospects that I'll be intrigued in if we took Alexander Sarr with the number 2 pick at number 26. The first one is point guard Carlton Bud Carrington. He's a point guard or combo guard out of Pittsburgh. He's not necessarily an explosive athlete. Doesn't get a ton of rim pressure, but he's a pure bucket getter. And he's crafty. And he gets buckets in a plethora of ways. Pull up, Jimbos, get into the rack. Like I said, he doesn't necessarily have a lot of rim pressure, but he's crafty around the rim once he does get there. But his pull-up game is mean. His mid-range game is mean. He can improve his three-point shot. But this is a guy that's going to be instant offense the day that he steps into the NBA. I don't care what type of athleticism he has. And his measurables kind of shocked me when I saw his measurables coming out of the draft combine, seeing that he was 6'4", 195. That's damn near John Wall type measurables, because his game reminds me of a Lou Williams type. A guy that's not necessarily super athlete, but a guy that's going to put the brown thing in the round thing, as my man Drew Gooden says. He's just simply going to score, whether that be contested shots, uncontested shots. He's going to put the ball in the hoop. So my comp for Bud Carrington out of Pittsburgh is like a 6'4". It's a bigger Lou Williams. And that is a guy that, you would love to have on your roster, and that's a guy that can contribute to winning teams, and that's a guy that at only 18 years old as of today, he fits the plan, he fits the process, he fits the timeline of the rebuild. So number one, if we select Alexander Sarr, would be Bud Carrington. My second prospect that I would love at 26, if we selected Alexander Sarr at 2, would be Bobby Klintman. He played last year at Wake Forest, but then he played in, I think it's the NBL, but he's from Sweden. He's a jumbo wing at 6'10", 235 pounds, and he's one of my favorite under the radar prospects in the entire draft. I don't know why I don't see too many people talking about Bobby Klintman. I was watching a interview with Michael Beasley where he was naming guys like, he was talking about his favorite type of basketball player, and he was naming guys like Brandon Ingram and Jason Tatum, and he said 6'10" with everything. Like that's my favorite type of basketball. Basketball player. 6'10" with everything. Well, guess what? Bobby Klintman fits that description. This is a guy that can shoot the ball. This is a guy that can pass the ball. And this is a guy that can give you some potential as a two-way player as well. While I think he's a little slow-footed as a player on the offensive end, and the defensive end as well, I do think he has the capability of defending bigger wings with his 7-foot wingspan. And he's a bucket getter. While I did mention that he was slow-footed, he's a guy that's going to get a lot of contact buckets. But he's a guy that knows how to use his shoulders as well. Think of how Jason Tatum uses his shoulders. Not necessarily on that scale, but the way that he uses those broad shoulders to navigate through the paint, to navigate through the lane, to get himself to the bucket, and ultimately sometimes play bigger than what he is. I see some of that potential in Bobby Klintman. One of the reasons why, and it sounds like he's a super prospect, one of the reasons why he's projected to be, available later in the draft is that his motor seems to run on and off sometimes. And at Wake Forest, he didn't necessarily have a super freshman season. I loved what I saw from him with his Sweden club team, where he was a play initiator. He was a connector. He showed a lot of different capabilities. Where he was 6'10" with everything. Like Beasley said. And yeah, this is a guy that fits the modern type of NBA where he gives you guys a multitude of different facets to his game while having the frame to hold up and defend a multitude of different positions as well. So he'll be my second favorite prospect at 26 if we select Alexander Sarr at 2. And my third favorite prospect in the scenario in which we select Alexander Sarr at 2 to be taken at 26 is shooting guard wing Kayshawn George, 6'7" wing out of the University of Miami, 6'7", 210 pounds with a 6'10" wingspan. So he has the length that Will Dawkins is coveting. He has the youth that Will Dawkins is coveting as well, fitting the timeline of this rebuild. He'll be only 20 years old at the time of opening night. And this is a guy that has shown real flashes as a shooter. I was kind of surprised at his measurables coming out of the combine, seeing that he was 210 pounds, because I think that he plays a little weaker than that at times. I don't know if he always plays to that 210-pound frame, but he's a knockdown shooter at 40% from the three-point line. And he also gives you some capability as an off-ball cutter, giving you some mid-range capability and giving you some just natural scoring capability. And I think that he has the potential to, if he takes it serious, if we get that defensive foundation going as a culture for the Wizards organization, I think that a guy like Kayshawn George has the potential to be a plus defender. Not saying that he's necessarily going to be lockdown clamps at any point in his career, but with his frame, he can be a plus defender at the 2 or the 3 guard position. So those are my 3 favorite prospects at 26 if we selected Alexander Sarr with the number 2 pick. So going on to my other scenario where we will select Zachary Researcher with the number 2 pick. While I wouldn't necessarily love the move, because I'm not, as you guys know, I'm not necessarily high on Researcher. While he has shown some improvements as a knockdown shooter, I don't think that he's ever going to be the type of shot creator that is worthy of a number 2 pick, especially in a weak draft, because you want that guy to be a bucket getter, right? Yeah, he can play lockdown defense. Yeah, he can be a 3-and-D guy. But with the number 2 pick in the draft, you're looking for a superstar. And I don't think that Zachary Researcher necessarily has the shot creation or the athleticism to ever be that type of guy. But I do think that he does fit what Will Dawkins, what Michael Winger like, and I do think that they're higher on him than I. So, moving on to my 3 favorite prospects to be selected at 26. If we were to select Zachary Researcher with the number 2 pick, and that first prospect would be center Khalil Ware out of Indiana. He's 7 foot, 230 pounds. And this is a guy why I really don't understand why he's been projected so low in the mocks. I watched a lot of Big Ten basketball, being a Merlin Terrapin college basketball fan, and I think that Khalil Ware was easily one of the best players in the entire league last season. At 7 feet, he's athletic. Not a once in a generation type athlete, but think of along the lines of like a Jackson Hayes type athlete, a Daniel Gafford type athlete that can give you a presence as a lob threat. But my favorite thing about Khalil Ware is that he shot 42% from the 3-point line last year. Now, while that was in limited attempts, so the sample size isn't huge, he's shown some promise where he would allow you to play that 5-out system that we know OKC to play. That is being popularized in today's NBA, where your center is behind the 3-point line initiating offense. And, with a guy like Will Dawkins and coming from OKC, he gives you, he's nowhere near the prospect of Chet Holmgren, but as in terms of a lob threat, in terms of a rim protector, in terms of a 3-point shooter, he's like a watered down version of Chet Holmgren. And I love what I saw from Khalil Ware, because he's only 20 years old, so he fits the timeline of the rebuild. And he gives you a lot of physical tools to work with. Some reasons why I do understand why he would be projected outside of the lottery is his defense can be a little susceptible at times when he's not necessarily protecting the rim. I do think there's some spatial awareness that he can improve on, especially out on the perimeter. Right now, I wouldn't put him in any situation in the pick and roll other than the drop. But I do think that with a lot of coaching, with a lot of development, he does have the potential to eventually, blitz those pick and rolls, guard in, ISO situations, not all game, but not necessarily be food out there on the perimeter. I do think that he has some of those physical tools. So I would love Khalil Ware at 26 if we did select Zachary Researcher with the number 2 pick. Moving on to my second favorite prospect that I would love at 26 if we selected Zachary Researcher with the number 2 pick, and that's Yves Missi, center from Baylor. So you see, I do want to go with my big man if we selected Zachary Researcher, because as I mentioned in my last episode, I think we arguably have the worst big man rotation in the NBA. So while I don't necessarily want to be redundant and draft 2 bigs in the first round, I do recognize and I do understand the need for bigs on this roster, and a guy like Yves Missi is a guy that can give you a defensive anchor. He can give you a culture. He can give you a foundation of what your team is going to be. Not necessarily ever going to be a superstar, but think about a guy like Bismack Biyombo in his prime. I'm not really trying to compliment to just African centers. I'm trying to think of guys with real defensive impact that have very limited offensive games, because outside of being a lob threat, he's not really going to give you much. He didn't even attempt a 3-pointer, let alone many mid-range shots. So defense is his calling card. Rim protection is his focus. Yeah, he's only 6'10", but he has a 7'1" wingspan, and he uses every bit of it. He's a strong finisher around the rim. He's powerful. So yeah, when you're drafting Yves Missi, you're drafting him for a particular type of play style, a particular type of culture that you want to set, and I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to that type of culture being injected in the Washington Wizards franchise, because we've been soft for far too long. So closing out my list and closing out this episode, the third prospect that I would love at 26 if we were to take Zachary Researcher with the number 2 pick is power forward DaRon Holmes from the University of Dayton. And This is the oldest prospect on my list. At 22 years old, he'll turn 23 at some point this season. So he isn't necessarily the ideal fit for the timeline. But if we are to compete in 4 to 5 years, he's going to be in his athletic prime at 27, 28 years old. But he's one of the best pure basketball players in the entire draft. He just simply knows how to play the game. 6'9", with a 6'10" wingspan. Oh, with a 7-foot wingspan, excuse me. And he uses every bit of it on the defensive end. He's a threat on the backboard, rebounding, and he has potential as a catch and shoot big as well, allowing you to play four out, 1 in, 5 out. With him shooting at about a 40% clip from the 3-point line this past season. I know a lot of rumors have come out that the Denver Nuggets have actually made him a promise, and the Denver Nuggets don't pick until 28. And last time I checked, 26 comes before 28. So if you want to go ahead and be a thief in the night like my man Young Thug and snatch up DaRon Holmes, because as we know, the Denver Nuggets know what they're doing in their front office, and they're an A+ organization at this point in the NBA and the 2024 NBA, and you want to be doing what the Denver Nuggets are doing. So if the Denver Nuggets are intrigued and have a lot of interest in DaRon Holmes, well, guess what? Damn it, you should too. And we don't owe the Denver Nuggets anything. We don't owe them any favors. So guess what? They shouldn't have let the news come out today and made DaRon Holmes a promise, because DaRon Holmes is a winning type basketball player that if we ever were to turn the tide, if this rebuild was to go the right way, he's a guy that's going to be making impact in playoff games. With not only his defense, with not only his rebounding, but his shooting as well. He's a guy that's going to fill the stat sheet and be a solid 12 to 13 year vet that every team is going to want to have at least one of those guys on your roster. So that's why I'm interested in taking DaRon Holmes with the 26th pick as well. So that'll do it for this episode. Let me know what you guys think about my list. Let me know what you guys think. Who do you want it to? How do you guys feel about, Alex Sarr not having as tight of a stranglehold on the number 1 pick as he did a couple weeks ago when we did our last episode. But yeah, that'll do it for this episode of WizKidsForever. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I'll check in on you guys later.